Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Mental Health and Wellbeing Global Summit. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Mike Sapiro. I'm a clinical psychologist, psychedelic assisted therapist, and meditation teacher. I'm very excited to be here with Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a retired physician and after 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience, worked for over a decade in Vancouver's downtown east side with patients challenged by drug addiction and mental illness. The best-selling author of 4 books published in 30 languages, including the award-winning In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. Dr. Mate is an internationally renowned speaker, highly sought after for his expertise on addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. For his groundbreaking medical work and writing, he has been awarded the Order of Canada, his country's highest civilian distinction, and the Civic Merit Award from his hometown, Vancouver. His 5th book, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture, was released on September 13th, 2022, and has been on the New York Times bestselling list for about 15 weeks now. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming on today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome. I would love to talk about your book and the myth of normal. Let's start off with just the basics, introducing our audience to what do you mean by the myth of normal?
Well, as a physician, I was trained to think of certain parameters of human life as normal and being equal to healthy and natural. So there's a normal body temperature range within which you can live, outside of which we die. There's a normal blood acidity, blood pressure, a range within we thrive, outside of which we fall ill or we die. So in that sense, what is normal is both healthy and natural. Now, in this culture, though, we make the assumption that what we're used to, what is normal, is also healthy and natural. And I'm saying that many of the conditions in this culture that we accept as normal are not only not healthy or natural, they're actually unhealthy and unnatural. And that begins with how we gestate children, how we give birth, how we raise children, how we treat each other, the values that we live by, the assumptions that we make about human nature, the way we understand illness and health. These are all normal, but they're not healthy or natural. As a matter of fact, what I'm saying is that most of what we call mental illness and much of physical illness are actually normal responses to abnormal circumstances.
Mm. So let's break that down a little more. I think mental illness like depression and anxiety are actually the responses our body and mind have to abnormal experiences.
That's my point as well.
Yeah. So can we, because I'd love our audience to know, so many of us think we're not healthy, something's wrong with us, but it's actually the circumstances in which we're living that it's what's not healthy.
Well, in this individualistic, materialistic society, we're taught to think of ourselves as isolated, discrete, individualistic beings. But as Bessel van der Kolk, the great trauma psychiatrist, points out, we barely even exist as individuals because our psychology, the way our minds function, the way our brain itself develops, is very much connected with our relationships to other people. And this begins actually in the womb. And then how we function throughout our life is very much conditioned by our emotional states, which is conditioned by our personal relationships, which is conditioned by the culture that we live in. Mm-hmm. So as a great American physician and psychiatrist, Dr. George Engel pointed out in 1977, I think, he said that we're biopsychosocial creatures. Our biology is influenced and in large cases determined by our psychological and social states and relationships. So therefore, whatever happens to us or whatever manifests in us as illness is actually the product of life experience in a certain context.
Mm-hmm. So what is your biggest hope for the book that you have out, which is clearly reaching so many people and having an impact already? What do you want the audience to get out of this? How do you want them to change or grow?
I was going to say that my biggest hope is that I get rich and famous, but
oh, nice! So you might be there already. I don't know. That's hilarious.
But I'll let that go. Look, my biggest hope is that actually our awareness catches up with the science, Because what I'm talking about and what you're talking about, the inseparability of mind and body, and how what we call mental illness are normal responses to abnormal circumstances. I'd say same thing is true of most of physical illness as well. This is not kind of clever insights on your part or my part. This is actually science. And I'm hoping that public awareness, and particularly the awareness of healthcare practitioners, will actually catch up with the science. Never mind catching up with the insights, catch up with the actual documented science. Because, as for example, as Richard Bentall, who's a British psychologist and a member of the British Academy, pointed out not that long ago, that the link between childhood adversity and adult mental health issues is as strongly established scientifically as the link between smoking and lung cancer. But how many psychiatrists even know that? And how many physicians get a single lecture on the mind-body unity or the relationship of childhood adversity and trauma to adult health outcomes? They don't. So that what's my biggest hope is that we catch up to science and that the public understands that it's not their fault. It's not any individual's fault. There's nothing wrong with an individual. It's a response to a context, and we have to look at that larger context to understand individual issues and struggles.
So there's two things here I'm wondering about. One, we still have individual work to do for our own healing and transformation. And yet there's also a systemic change we're going to want to make to create a healthier environment, healthier context for humans to live in. I'm not going to say chicken and egg because they're both vital and important. Which ones do we address? Both? And
well, of course, you've never talked before, so I don't know your personal history, but I've certainly had to deal with my own personal mental health challenges and work them through, and the trauma that was the template for mental health issues. I could talk about that. At the same time, it's a social issue. Like, for example, in your country, the United States, 25% of women have to go back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth, which amounts to a massive abandonment of their infants. Not that they mean to abandon them, it's just they have to, because that's social economic imperative. Now, that means that at least 25% of American infants suffer an abandoned trauma within 2 weeks of birth. Well, that has huge consequences. And if you want to look at why childhood suicide rates are rising, which they are, why the number of children being diagnosed with ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, and some of these diagnoses are total nonsense, by the way, but they're diagnosed anyway. Behavior problems, learning problems, depression, anxiety. Anxiety is the fastest growing diagnosis in North America. These are not individual questions. They're social questions, and they're driven by social conditions, not as the fault of the parents, but because of the stresses that parents have to face in raising families these days. So yes, the answers have to be both on the individual level, but also on the social level.
Just hearing what you said about 25% of women after birth have to go back, I can imagine if we have some people listening right now to that, there may be a sense of shame that arises as if they've done something wrong, where the culture itself is actually in imposition. It's oppressive the way it's running right now.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the very idea that the impact of social conditions are the fault of individuals is itself endemic in capitalist culture, because we make everything individualistic. So if there's something wrong, it's got to be your fault. And we're not trained to think systemically. Now, what woman decides to be poor so they have to go back to work? What woman decides to be depressed, which affects the mental health development of their child? Who decides to be stressed? Who decides to be part of an oppressed minority? Like in my country, Canada, the people most prone to have addictions, ADHD, suicidality, depression, anxiety are actually the indigenous population. Now, did they choose to be colonized? Did they choose to be tormented and tortured for 100 years in residential schools while their children were abducted and sexually and physically, emotionally abused. Whose fault was that? So, I mean, this whole idea that people should feel shame
Mhm.
because they have to go back to work because they're poor. Who decided there should be such rising inequality in our society? And the inequality is rising, so that I read a statistic recently that in the last 10 years, the bottom 50% of the population gained $700 billion and the top 1% gained 10 trillion. Who decided that?
Mhm.
So whose fault is it? So there's no room for individual shame here. What there is room for is a really compassionate but
Mhm.
deep examination of the social conditions that create such difficulty for so many people. In my country, again, in Canada, and this is similar to the US, by the way, if you're an indigenous woman, your risk of having rheumatoid arthritis is 6 times greater than that of the average. Now, before colonization, they used to have no rheumatoid arthritis whatsoever. Are we supposed to blame them for having rheumatoid arthritis? Or do we wish to understand that that illness, like many other illnesses, is a function?
Mhm. How can we help people release the shame? And is it just simply by knowing the context in which they're living is an oppressive context on their psyche, their bodies and spirits? Or are there methods or ways that you help people understand they don't have to be ashamed of something they didn't cause to release that?
Well, I mean, I think it's all that. In the book, The Myth of Normal, I talk about 5 levels of compassion. And the second level is what I call compassion of context, where you actually understand the sources of somebody's suffering.
Mhm.
As soon as you do that, there are no individuals to be blamed.
Mhm.
Um, but also, of course, it goes a bit deeper because shame as a dynamic has got nothing to do with anybody doing anything wrong. Now, there's a healthy remorse. If I
Mhm.
promise to show up for this interview and instead I go partying with my buddies and I don't show up for this interview, I should feel some healthy remorse.
Mhm.
That's healthy. Unless I'm a sociopath, I'm going to feel some healthy remorse for letting people down. That's not shame.
Mhm.
Shame is a sense that there's something deeply wrong with the self. There's an unworthiness. And that originates long before we have any language. It's got nothing to do with what we did. It's got to do with where we connected with emotionally. And when we weren't, we assumed there's something wrong with us.
Mhm.
And for most people, that's pre-verbal.
Mhm. With my work with first responders, firemen, police, combat vets, who are not first responders, but that kind of line of work,
Yeah,
there is a lot of embedded shame about having PTSD. And my first job is to help them understand the context of their work,
right.
what it does physiologically, neurologically, and to the psyche. Just the context of being a first responder, your body and mind are going to react a certain way. And so we don't have to have shame. It could be a matter of fact. Hey, this is a consequence of your line of duty.
Exactly. And I actually talk about first responders in the book. Um, but there's another aspect to it that you might have found yourself is that, yes, it's in the nature of policemen, firemen, first responders to see a lot of suffering, to see a lot of trauma, to see a lot of death and illness, injury, tragedy. That's true.
Mhm.
At the same time, the people that develop PTSD are very often people that were already traumatized in childhood,
Mhm.
so that the template for the post-traumatic stress is already there. And then is these adult experiences trigger them. And so this has been studied certainly in veterans that those that are more at risk are the ones who had suffered trauma in
Mhm.
childhood. And so that it's a combination of childhood template and programming and then adult experience that results in the full-blown PTSD. I'm sure you've seen some of that, isn't it?
Oh, a lot. And actually, it's almost funny. I'll get firemen coming in. I do ketamine treatment,
Oh
and
yeah,
so they think they might be coming in for a SIDS call, something that was terrible that they had to witness.
yeah,
And all of these guys and some women end up talking about their fathers and their mothers, and
yeah.
while they're under ketamine, what comes out is really the deeper wounds that they haven't unlocked or healed or nurtured themselves through,
I'm
rather
sure.
than yeah.
I'm curious. I've worked with psychedelics. I've not worked with ketamine so much. I've experienced it a few times. Do you find it an effective modality?
With therapy, I find it more effective than anything I've ever done
Really?
in the healing field.
That's
It
great.
tends to unlock and dissolve the defenses that are always in place. And
Yeah,
so then people are able to speak their truths in a way they hadn't, or they discover their truths in ways they've been avoiding.
exactly. Which is what psychedelics in general can do.
And then with therapy, combining it, now we have
Yeah,
a way that we can help them explore the deeper aspects of their psyche and those wounds we're talking about
yeah.
that underlie that where the programming was created in the first place. And I know your work goes down that to that place.
I'm sure that you've seen it as I've seen it as well. That psychedelics combined with a safe holding context
Mm-hmm.
and integrative therapy is, well, Freud once said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. I actually think psychedelics are the royal road to the unconscious because with the dreams you often don't know what the heck they're about.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot of skilled interpretation, and I think Freud interpretation of his patient's dreams was ridiculous, in many cases. But with psychedelics, the person is actually there to
Mm-hmm.
be awake and
That's right.
witnessing their unconscious.
Yeah, and that itself is medicinal, having a sense of awareness
That's right.
and being a little bit separated from the experience itself.
That's right.
They use that in their waking normal lives and can watch themselves have reactions and go, I don't need to do this reaction right now. I can choose something different because I can
Yeah.
see it now.
Or I can see that this reaction is not to the present, but to the past.
Right. This is a condition, a habit that's coming forward. Yeah.
Exactly.
Your work, a lot of your work speaks to the underlying pain and wounds that came from even ancestral, right through to the infant as a young child.
Yeah.
What are some healing modalities you recommend and for our audience to consider?
Well, first of all, just before I move to healing modalities,
Mm-hmm.
um, in my view, everything we call mental illness, um, which itself, by the way, is a questionable term,
Mm-hmm.
um, but everything we call that is rooted in trauma, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they're responses to trauma. So um, my my first book was on ADHD after I was diagnosed with it, and it's just been republished in the U.S. with its original Canadian title, "Scattered Minds."
Mm-hmm.
And happy to tell you, next week it's going to be on the New York Times bestsellers list. This is a 25-year-old book, 24-year-old book, and in which I argued that ADHD is not this genetic disease that this but you keep worshiping at the altar of genetic causation. It's not genetic. It may run in families, but it's not genetic. What it is a defensive response to stress in infancy.
Mm-hmm.
So as a Jewish infant under the Nazis in Hungary, I had plenty of reasons to tune out to the horrors and to my mother's terrors that were occurring around us.
Mm-hmm.
This is when the brain is developing. So then the tuning out gets programmed into the brain, but it's a defensive response. It's not this disease, it's a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
And if more and more kids are being diagnosed with it, that alone proves that it's not genetic because genes don't change in a population over 10, 15, 20 years. What's happening is that more and more young infants and children are stressed because of the parent stresses in this toxic culture, and they're more tuning out more when their brain is being wired.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to understand that in order to understand healing modalities. So we're not trying to change somebody's genes here or just trying to suppress somebody's symptoms with medication, useful as they can be sometimes. We're actually trying to change the traumatic template because the trauma isn't what happened to kids, it's what happened inside them as a result of it. And so that treatment modalities to understand A, that originates in trauma, and B, that the trauma is not the external event, but the internal psychological and emotional and physiological responses. That's what makes healing possible. Because this trauma is what happened inside me.
Hmm.
I can change that. I can't change what happened to me at 1 year of age. I can change what happened inside me. I can change the wound. I can heal the wound that I'm carrying inside. So your question about treatment modalities, all of them that recognize the embodied traumatic nature of
Hmm.
what we call mental, let alone physical illness. Those all those modalities offer some possibilities. So there's a whole range of them.
Of course. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. All the work I've done, whether people come in for depression or anxiety, attention regulation issues,
Yeah.
existential dilemmas, every time it points back to core woundings and programming and not being seen or being heard explicitly. I don't believe in depression and anxiety as standalone disorders.
It's so important what you just said about being seen and heard because when people think of trauma, they always think of like the big ticket events, like it's a parent dying or violence in the family or, addictions or, physical, sexual, emotional abuse. Those are traumatic, all right. But trauma means a wound.
Mhm.
Child could be wounded by not being seen and heard. Never mind being hit. Never mind the parent dying. Just if you're not seen and heard the way you
Yeah.
need to be. That can be wounding, especially to sensitive children. So that's absolutely important to recognize that. And a lot of people think that this happy childhood, and then you talk to them,
Mhm.
you realize they were never seen or heard,
Mhm.
you know? So that's really essential.
Mhm. Yeah, and that becomes very clear the deeper we go when we start following the thread of their core heart wound. It
Yeah.
always turns out to be I was like really not neglected in some way. That doesn't mean with food or in poverty. It
And it
means
doesn't mean and it doesn't mean that your parents didn't do their best. And it doesn't mean that your parents didn't love you. I mean, I loved my kids, but I know I passed my trauma on to them because I didn't see them for who they were, because I couldn't see myself, so I
Mhm.
couldn't be attuned with them because
Mhm.
I wasn't attuned to myself either.
Yeah.
And so depression, I mean, the word itself should tell us what it's about. What does it mean to depress something? It
Mhm.
means to push it down.
Mhm.
What gets pushed down in depression? Our emotions become flat. We call that a flat
Mhm.
affect.
Mhm.
Why do we push down our emotions? Because our early environment couldn't accept them. So to be accepted to our early environment, we had to push down our feelings. And then 30 years later, you're diagnosed with this disease called depression, and you're told this is because of a lack of serotonin in your brain. And, I've taken fluoxetine and SSRI, elevate serotonin levels, and it helped me, but
Mhm.
it doesn't prove
No.
that my depression was caused by any serotonin problem. In fact, you know what? For all the talk about this depression being a biological brain disease, there's zero proof that it's got anything to do with lack of serotonin. And I mean, literally zero proof scientifically. And the fact that I take an SSRI and it helps me, as it sometimes can, it's not the answer, but it can certainly help with the symptom. And I was grateful enough for that, believe me. But it no more proves that my depression was caused by lack of serotonin than if I'm socially shy and I go to a party and I have a drink and all of a sudden I become sociable and friendly in the life of the party. Does that prove that my social reticence was caused by a lack of alcohol in my brain? I mean, we make all these false associations, you know? So whether or not medications help, and sometimes you've probably seen this yourself, they can be life-saving,
Mhm.
but they say nothing about the causation.
Mhm.
And the causation is always in that early wounding.
Can we speak a little bit about fear as one of the original causes of kind of, when I think about depression versus anxiety, there are different presentations and people come for different core reasons. But in the end, there's so much fear. And what I find I work with often is how we relate to fear.
Yeah,
Uh,
so say more about that. Fear of what? Like, what do you mean when you say that?
Oh my gosh, fear of being seen, fear of not being seen, fear of failure, fear of not being perfect, fear of actual being pushed out of the tribe, of
Yeah, well, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. In fact, you know what? In this book, I have a chapter on attachment versus authenticity.
mm, mm,
And attachment is just a need to belong and to be accepted. I mean, we don't survive without it.
mm,
Certainly, as infants and children, we don't. Even as adults, we have a hard time. So that's one need that we have is for that attachment relationship. But
mhm.
we also the need to be able to experience all our feelings
Yeah.
and to be connected to our gut feelings and to ourselves. Well, if the child is put in a dilemma where who they are and what they feel and how they manifest is not acceptable to the environment, then they will disconnect from their true selves and their true emotions.
Hmm.
And they'll have this fear of not being accepted.
Hmm.
They have a fear of showing up authentically. They'll have a fear of rejection because that was their experience.
Yeah.
And so the fear that you're talking about, again, is a normal response to an early environment where I had to work in order to be accepted. And if I didn't work hard enough to be accepted, I might not be.
And that fear ultimately can move us through patterns and habits of being somebody we're else, somebody we're not. And so we end up being misaligned with who we are. I actually think most of our mental health concerns or issues come from not being aligned with who we truly are on the inside.
I 100% agree with you. And that's why authenticity is such a theme in both my therapeutic work and also in my writing. And the, um, the great stress researcher, the person who actually coined the word stress and showed the impact of stress on laboratory rats, Hans Selye, his name was. He was a fellow Hungarian actually who came to Canada and was a doctor here, and he did the work at University of Montreal.
Mm,
But he said that the biggest stress of all is trying to be who you're not.
mm,
And that has huge implications, not just for mental health, but also for physical health.
mm,
And, in this culture, there's such a demand to fit in and not to be ourselves, not to speak our truth, not even to know our own truth.
right.
And so that, people come to people like you and I, basically, because then they need to be themselves. You know, I just finished reading a current bestseller, which is Prince Harry's Spare, the
Mm,
autobiography of the Duke of Sussex, who was grandchild of Queen Elizabeth, and he's been on a lot of interviews and so on, and he's faced his mental health issues, and there was such pressure in that royal family for people not to be ourselves, not to be themselves,
mhm,
but to be their roles.
mhm,
So even behind his walls of incredible privilege, there's these suffering human beings who cannot be themselves, and that struggle to be ourselves, that's actually is the most sacred and necessary struggle that we all engage in.
mm.
There's a lot of people in this culture who get to be in their 40s and 50s, like I was. Whose life am I leading anyway?
Yeah.
And who am I anyway? Now, no 1 day old baby faces that dilemma. They know exactly how to be who they are and how to manifest who they are and how to express their feelings and how to experience their feelings. So something happens. And that something is what you call not being seen and not being heard and not being accepted.
Mhm. What are some of the damages that come when we live a life misaligned? Damage in the body, in the mind, in our psyches.
Well, this may sound mm, startling, but autoimmune disease, for example, so that people that repress their emotions and try to be nice and acceptable to other people, they have a much higher risk of autoimmune disease. Why? Because you can't separate the mind from the body. And
Mhm,
not being yourself and being very nice and being ignoring your own needs and serving the needs of others creates a lot of physiological stress for you,
mhm,
which then has an impact on the immune system and the nervous system and so on. So autoimmune disease, malignancy. I'm not saying all malignancy, but having worked in family practice and palliative care, looking after terminally ill people, having also read the scientific literature, there's a huge connection between people repressing themselves and the onset of malignancy. I write about this in a number of my books, including this one. I don't have time to go into the physiology of it, but it's pretty straightforward. So, physical illness, what we call mental illness, like pushing yourself down, depressing yourself, depressing your emotions. Well, there's depression. Anxiety, you mentioned. Our brains are wired for fear. We actually have a fear circuit in our brain. That's a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Survival. It depends on it.
Exactly. But what if we have to be afraid of things we shouldn't have to be afraid of? I should be afraid of a saber-toothed tiger. I'd be not living much longer if I ran across one and I wasn't afraid. But should I be afraid of my parents? Should I be afraid of my father's moods? Should I be afraid of being rejected if I'm not nice or compliant? Those are not fears that nature created for us. Those are fears that are the outcomes of an unhealthy culture. And then the panic. There's a circuit in our brain for panic. It's a good thing. Because if you're a 1-day-old infant or a 3-day-old infant and you're alone and there's nobody around because your parents left you in a room by yourself, you should panic because you're wired to connect with your parents physically. You're wired to be held by them. So you should panic. Then you scream, and then that should bring your parents running. But what if your parents don't come? What if your parents listen to one of these stupid parenting experts or one of these stupid doctors like I used to be who'll tell you, no, let him sleep it off. Let him cry himself back to sleep. Then the panic gets wired into your brain. And you won't even recall this because this is before the days of verbal memory. But inside your brain, there's an overactivated panic circuit. And then you're diagnosed later on with panic disorder. It's not a disorder. It's a normal response to something abnormal. You tell a mother bear not to go to their infant if their infant is in distress. But we're telling human parents this all the time. So these mental health conditions are in every case an overactivation of dynamics that would have been just normal had they been taken care of, but they weren't.
My panic circuit sounds like my Jewish mother, right? So some of it's not actually my natural circuitry. It's inherited from, as a third generation Holocaust survivor, I have this imprinted on me that everything is dangerous and scary. And so I have a panic system that I inherited on top of my own. And I found it's hard to differentiate sometimes what's mine and what's my ancestry.
You know, Michael, that's true. And there's the whole new science of epigenetics that I'm sure you're familiar with, that not our genes, but our genes' function can be affected by life experience. And those experiences in the form of genetic activation can be passed on to other generations. So that's true. But I would argue, if you were my client, that it's not just the stories that you heard. Okay? It's also your own personal experience in a certain family of origin that creates those panic responses. You know, like, so it's not just that you were wired because your parents were wired in a certain way. It's also stuff happened to you.
Absolutely.
Where you developed in a certain way, so that it's not so. Trauma is both absolutely multi-generational, but it's also recreated in each generation for each new generation. You know, there's a biblical saying that the sins of the fathers will be visited upon the children into the fourth generation. Well, it's absolutely true. Not if we see sin as a moral failure, but in the original Hebrew meaning of the word, which is like a mistake or where you missed the mark. And when one generation misses the mark, That's passed down the generations. It's not blaming anybody, but I would say that you're you inherited a legacy of suffering,
Mhm.
but also you had your own share of suffering,
Mhm.
quite apart from the legacy, or as a result of that legacy.
So I'm wondering, yeah, for our viewers who have carried, they have their own legacy they're working with, the history of their families, and then they have their reaction to
Yeah,
being in that system, in that culture of their family
exactly,
at the same time.
exactly.
Yeah. Hmm. And I know for me, compassion and unconditional love, especially for myself as I suffer, is one of the strongest medicines I've used. And I
Mm.
know you're steeped in compassion as a healer, and what you teach, your books radiate compassion for those you work with and for yourself as you shared some of your own stories with the readers.
For myself, sometimes, yes.
Mm.
It it um, it continues to be a challenge. You know, I think for a lot of us, I've met a lot of people who come to me for therapy, or people who I'm training, and their capacity to be compassionate to others is actually far outstrips their capacity to be compassionate to themselves.
Of course.
They
Yeah.
don't even notice. They don't even notice when they're not being compassionate. They usually notice when they're not compassionate to others, but they have trouble noticing
Mhm.
they're not compassionate to themselves. You know, like take something like, um, oh, uh, why should I feel this way? Other people have suffered so much more than I have. You
Mhm.
know, it's a very common thing people will say, which is
That's the worst. It's the worst for them because we need it
yeah,
the most from ourselves.
exactly, yeah, exactly.
So that's one. I wanted just to have the audience hear some ideas from you of practices that they can start engaging in, daily practices that actually will move them toward, first of all, recognizing they're normal, and
Yeah,
second of all, that they're not broken. They're in a broken culture, a broken context. So, what are some practices you can recommend for our audience?
sure. So in one chapter of the book, we lay out an exercise which begins with a simple question. You can do this once a week. Write it down. What am I not saying no to? And by what I mean is, when there's a no that wants to be said, but you don't say it because you want to be accepted, because you want to be nice, because you want to fit in, because you tell yourself a story that if I say no, I'm selfish and all that. So where are you not saying no? That's one question.
Mm-hmm.
Second question is, what is the impact on me of not saying no? What is the impact? I get tired, I get
Mm-hmm.
resentful, I don't, Number three, what is the belief behind my difficulty saying no? No, it's not nice to say no, I'm selfish, others won't like me. Before, where did you get these stories? So there's very simple exercises people can do, just questions they can ask themselves. Once I'm told that that exercise alone has changed people's lives. Just if you do it once a week, you
Mm-hmm.
know, I've given you the gist of it. There's six questions altogether. The last one is, what are you not saying yes to? In other words, when there's a yes inside you that you want to say, but you're not saying it because you're too busy, or you know, what do you want to create? What do you want to do? What are you passionate about? What turns you on that you're not honoring?
Mm-hmm.
Because, as again, the stress researcher Hans Selye said that not to express what's in us is as harmful as taking on the stress of others. So very simple questions, or um, some practice that helps you develop awareness of yourself, such as various meditational practices. And in this case, I don't mean meditation that puts you into beautiful spiritual realms. I mean, I'm not against that. That's fine. But that can be used as an escape rather than a healing. So the healing comes in when you become aware of what's in your mind. Well, there's my mind telling me stories again. Well, there's my story that I'm a bad person again. Oh, hello. So dealing with these trauma is imprints certain kind of dynamics in you. One of them is constant self-criticism,
Mm-hmm.
which I call these the stupid friends. I mean, jokingly. Friends, because originally they came along to actually help you get accepted, so that um, if a child tells themselves, "Oh, I better not be bad," or if I do such and such, I'm bad. That's actually the child's way of staying connected to their environment. So that's a friend.
Mm.
However, the stupidity comes in because these dynamics, they don't learn that you're no longer 3 years old. They hang around. So becoming friends with these, what I call stupid friends,
Mhm.
or obtuse friends, finding out their original function
Mhm.
rather than being afraid of them. Oh, thanks, but I don't need you anymore. At
Right.
least I don't need your advice anymore. I can take care of myself. These are
Right.
simple practices.
Mhm.
Um, then again, meditation that promotes awareness, body um, practices such as yoga done consciously
Mhm.
that puts you in, okay, what's my body's position right now? What am I feeling inside my body? So awareness of the body, these are important. Nature, connecting with the unity that nature always manifests.
Mhm.
Um, um, Music, both participating in it or listening to it in a conscious way, not passively, but consciously. There's lots of great indigenous healing practices such as drumming and chanting and dancing.
Yep. Dancing.
Can
Yeah.
be very healing. You know what? We haven't even said anything about therapy, you know?
Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's available to almost anybody,
Mhm.
you know?
That's well beyond psychotherapy, and it
Yeah,
can be integrated in therapy.
exactly.
Yeah, all of those suggestions are so important because it takes an embodiment.
Yeah,
We become embodied of the values we're looking for when we're dancing or drumming. We're aware, we're conscious, we're actually in the body that's performing a thing
that's right.
where we often don't live, but where the best health is in the body, the best
Exactly.
experience.
Exactly. And from that perspective, those therapeutic modalities that connect with the body, that understand that it all begins with trauma, and then help us connect with the body, um, they're the ones I tend to favor. Therapy
Mhm.
is just, the whole model of the person lying on their back on the couch and the psychoanalyst is, you know, forget forget the stories, forget the endless unconscious chatter. Let's get in touch with the body.
Mhm.
That's where it all lives.
I love that. I love all these approaches, and I also like the way you relate to what we call the inner critic.
Yeah.
That it's actually a friend who's very unskillful, and sometimes it doesn't seem like a friend. That
Yeah.
inner critic could be very.
Thank you. Unskillful friend is a better name than stupid friend. People have problem with the word stupid, so let's let's call it the unskillful friend.
It's unskillful because actually there is some wisdom in it. Even shadow selves have wisdom in them. They're just super unskillful in how they relate what they want from
No,
for us.
no, the only problem I have with the word unskillful is they weren't unskillful to start with.
No, but they've become. They
Yeah,
use that same kind of immature language to get us to do something.
exactly.
So I often help people recognize you can talk to that part of you and say, I want to hear what you have to say, but I can't hear it the way you're saying it. And
Uh-huh.
that part actually starts shifting and becomes more skillful in a way. It says, hey, be careful of this, be mindful,
Interesting.
approach this situation differently.
Well, I like that one. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So I love these approaches. And as we're wrapping up this interview, I like to end these interviews with like a wish that you have for the audience. If you could wish something for them, what would the wish be for their well being or growth?
You know, I hadn't planned this, but let me read you a paragraph or two from the book, if I may.
Please.
In the book, I talk about Robin Williams, and Robin Williams had his mental health issues all his life, addiction issues, ADHD. In the end, he developed dementia, Lewy body disease. Um, he was also this incredible talent, incredible sensitivity, incredible humanity, creativity, um, and in his film, Good Will Hunting, which is, I just saw it recently. It's just a beautiful film with Matt Damon. And Damon plays this incredibly bright guy who's emotionally all stunted. And the most iconic scene from the movie features Williams' therapist getting right in Damon's face and repeating a simple but powerful statement: "It's not your fault," until the latter finally collapses, sobbing into his embrace. That message, "It's not your fault," conveys not just undaunted compassion, for which Damon's character was starving inside, but wisdom too. From behavioral problems to full-blown mental illness is not anyone's fault, nor, as we've seen, the fault of their brains or their genes. It's an expression of untended wounds, and it's meaningful. The meaning extends beyond people's individual lives, their families of origin, and their childhoods. If we're going to address the myriad reflections to which this book has devoted its attention so far, we need to look at through a wider lens at a bigger story. If I could distill my message and insert it into that beautiful cinematic moment, I would have Robin Williams look all of us in the eye, including himself, and say with assurance, "It's not your fault and it's not personal."
Mm.
So drop the shame and look at the context and work on work on developing that compassion for yourself that you and I have talked about, or noticing when that compassion is absent. That's the biggest message I want to get across to people.
Mm. Thank you so much. Beautiful message. And that was a poignant part in that movie that I felt too. We do need to hear that message over and over again.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your wisdom, your presence today. I appreciate it. And I hope we all go out and read your book so you could be wealthy and famous. And
It's about time. Thank you so much for this conversation. I enjoyed it so much.
thank you. Take good care.
You too. Bye bye.
Okay.